So I would, very briefly present one part of our findings, which is based on the case studies that we collected. And I'll just give a very brief background to the study. It is a study which was conducted in 3 states, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand and Bihar, and particular districts and particular blocks of those districts were focused upon. This part of the study, the idea was to collect at least 16 case studies from each of these areas, which go back not more than 5 years prior to the time this study was started. And why these states? So these are the states, at least when we began our study, these were the states which had a special law on witch hunting. Now, of course, many more states have come up with laws on witch hunting. I'll discuss the results of the study. We collected 48 case studies, 16 each from each of the states. Although we've done some kind of statistical analysis of our data because it's a significant number of cases coming together in one place. However, it is not primarily a statistical study. The basic main themes of analysis that we have done of the case studies are regarding who the victims of witch hunting are, who the perpetrators of witch hunting are, what factors lead to witch hunting, and what are the violations and consequences of witch hunting, and what are the responses to witch hunting by the family, community and the state. So starting with the question of who are the victims of witch hunting, most of our cases are of women. But we also found that there are male victims of witch hunting. Largely the victims were middle-aged, in fact predominantly married, but also sometimes widowed women from lower economic strata. They had hardly any formal education, and also they were spread across a cross-section of caste and communities. We didn't find any particular concentration in particular communities. We also found that in a number of cases, the husbands, sons, daughters and other members of victims' families are also co-victims or secondary victims, or sometimes even direct victims of witch hunting. One major thing that in a sense we did find was that although it is women in the age group of 50 to 60 who are most vulnerable to this kind of violations, yet it is not necessary that they should be widowed. If you look at the issue of who the perpetrators of these violations are, we found that in a very large number of cases, the victims and perpetrators are very closely related to each other. Very often, the perpetrators are the woman's husbands, brothers, distant or immediate, family of the husband is directly involved in cases of witch hunting. And we also found that women are also, involved in, instigating and taking part in this kind of violence. Although male perpetrators are more in number, we also found that there's no obvious intercaste or interclass dynamics to this form of violence, which is not to say that witch hunting cannot happen in cases of intercaste and interclass conflicts, but somehow in our data, this sort of cases were not dominant. Because if you look at the first point over here that people are closely related, then obviously they don't belong to different castes and communities very often. We found that sometimes the victim may be less prosperous than the perpetrator. Sometimes it's more or less the same status, sometimes it's the other way around. This is some sort of a more generalized possibility of violence cutting across different kinds of groups. Now, coming to the issue of what factors lead to witch hunting, in this we found that there are 2 kinds of things. So one is the long-term issues which lead up to witch hunting, and we found that in most of the cases we could identify that there are complex and long-term family disputes which seem to lead up to identification and labeling of a person as a witch. And at least in 2/3 of cases we found that there were clear material factors which were the basis of a conflict between the victim and the perpetrators, and moreover between their families. To elaborate this a little, there were disputes over land, intentions to grab land or house or offset legitimate claims to property, jealousy over prosperity and well-being of the victims' families. If somebody's been very entrepreneurially successful, or even small things like somebody's installed a hand pump, or there is some dispute over where a drain has been constructed, a religious pillar has been constructed, or some land has been encroached, there is an obstruction to a common passage, or position in local bodies, positions in local schools, and who's going to get a contract over some agriculture. There were few cases also of sexual advances or an ex-husband involved in trying to get rid of his wife, etc. Apart from these long-term disputes, there is some kind of trigger for labeling someone as a witch, either an actual or an alleged illness or death of a human, or sometimes even animals, cattle and so on. And sometimes it could be a series of such deaths and illnesses happening in a village, or sometimes other kinds of things like a bad crop, or there's some suspicions about somebody is doing some rituals. Then how does the identification of somebody as a witch take place? And we found that any kind of physical contact or some verbal statement made by such a person with whom there has been a long-term dispute, or sometimes just this imputation of very evil intentions, become the proof for the death or the illness which has happened. There are also several cases in which a ojha or a bega or whatever, a local medicine man of some sort may be involved. So these are the people who are usually approached to discern the cause of an illness, and they may point towards somebody who then ends up becoming labeled as a witch. When we analyze all these cases, what we feel is that witch hunting seems to be a mechanism of targeting someone for a variety of material reasons, but alongside that, it's situations of grave suffering, where illness and death are very common and there's no recourse to basic health care or civic amenities. That's the sort of situation which seems to provide impetus for such disputes to take the form of witch hunting. Now, if you look at the violations and consequences which follow from witch hunting, then again there are two kinds of things which we need to focus upon, and one is the labeling or stigmatization, the violence and the torture which is experienced by the victims and their families. And the other thing is the long-term social and economic consequences. And both these we feel are very important when we are looking at the state response to these kind of incidences. Now, usually witch hunting begins with, as I said, with identification and labeling of a person as a witch, and several local terms like Dai and Chudayal, etc. used. These seem to be common local terms of abuse, and other terms of abuse are also used in cases of witch hunting and vice versa. It then becomes very difficult to isolate witch hunting or using of these kinds of terms, and this is something which is part of the special laws that somebody is identified as a witch and so on. So, but often this is so mixed up with local forms of abuse that it cannot be easily isolated in the first place. But there is what we would argue a kind of continuum of violations experienced by the victims, and this is something which is again usually not highlighted in the discourse on witch hunting, that a lot of cases of witch hunting do not culminate in gruesome killings and murder, which doesn't mean that they are not serious in their implications, but in fact the cases which don't involve very serious forms of violence are far more frequent and barely ever come to light, because they don't seem to touch the media, the state, they don't seem to become apparent at all. So in a sense, what we are saying is that it is far more prevalent, it has a much greater impact in the lives of women than would be assumed only by looking at the cases which culminate in death and murder. There are very serious long-term social and economic consequences for the victims as well as their families. If they die, then their families, or if they survive this kind of violence, then they themselves. So even after physical violence may be over, the social and economic consequences continue. Stigma, of course, being one long-term consequence, but in a large number of cases, there are people lose property, livelihood, and any kind of resources that they may have been able to garner in their previous lives. They are often denied access to public resources. In a large number of cases, also physically dislocated, they cannot return to their villages, and sometimes they are forced to pay fines or take oaths or perform rituals, etc. And the state interventions do not at all address such consequences of witch hunting. Last point is about responses to witch hunting, and we looked at responses of the family, neighbors, community, the local authorities and the state. Just talking about the family, we found that the immediate families in large number of cases found the husbands or the children of women who are victimized as witches. they are, offered support, and that support itself sort of becomes a reason for those people to be victimized. In a very large number of cases, these family members are also neighbors, or other neighbors are also involved. We all know that witch hunting is a kind of violation which is done with the complicity of community members, and we found a very high level of evidence of this kind of complicity that makes such violence possible in the first place. But we look more closely at the response of the local authorities, that is the panchayat, and then the police, as because that's when the whole question of law and state becomes important. So what we find that it was only in a very small number of minority of cases that the victims got any help from the panchayat. In a large number of cases, in some cases there was no role that the panchayats played, but in a much larger number of cases the perpetrators were supported or helped by the panchayats, and there are also many cases in which there was some sort of ambiguousness in the role of the panchayat. So it doesn't seem that the local state authorities stand by the victims in all cases. In fact, they seem to, very often they are not on the side of the victims. Some of the cases which don't lead to very gruesome forms of violence, it is because local authorities have come to the support of the women, or in some cases there are also some women's self-help groups which have come to the support of women. But in most other cases, we find that this kind of support structures are missing. And finally, looking at the response of the state in terms of the role of the police, what we found is that in a very large number of cases, women don't approach the police, for various reasons. And in a good number of cases, they are also prevented from going to the police by either the local people or including the panchayat. So less than half the cases in our data would have got to the police, and even then we did not find many cases reaching any kind of successful resolution, because we found a lot of cases which are either compromised or dismissed, or not registered, or they drag on. So it doesn't seem that even the cases which really go to the police end in any kind of successful resolution of the matter in the favor of the victim. And this is a point from which I will go hand over to Madhu, where she will talk more about the state role in all this.